The verse of the day is Acts 18:9, and it says, "One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision and told him, 'Don't be afraid, speak out, don't be silent.'" Don't be afraid, he said. To give a little context, Paul is in the city of Corinth. So let's review. The book of Acts is the beginning of the church. So Paul and the apostles are going from city to city, town to town to preach the good news because Jesus just died, rose again, and left his spirit. So now the apostles get to be the first people to spread the good news. That's our job, is to go from town to town to tell everyone about Jesus. And that is a hard job to have when most of the culture lives by the law, when most of the culture lives by doing, not by believing. They had to come up against a lot of things. They had to come up against a ton of conflict, a lot of hard days, jail time, being stoned. You name it, they probably came up against it. Something that I recently learned too is that almost all of the apostles, I think all of them, died brutal deaths, died excruciatingly brutal deaths, and were murdered. And I think that speaks to how difficult it was for them to spread the word, to get the word out about Jesus, and how they had to have encounters and Jesus had to show up in really physical ways. Like today's verse says, it says, "One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision." So they had these visions and experiences that were very real and tangible of Jesus speaking directly to them in that way and audibly, because they needed that guidance. They needed that extra help in order to spread the church. So now you and I, we don't necessarily have those kind of experiences. I don't doubt that God can't do it because he can do whatever he wants. But our version of hearing God and being directed now is through the word, because these people who were living back then took note of everything that they were experiencing so that you and I could learn from it and grow ourselves today. From what I read as well, the city of Corinth was seen to be a pagan city. So a city that was just like really living life crazily, for lack of better words. Of course, Paul's going to come up against some conflict. And earlier in this chapter, verse 6, it says, "But when they opposed and insulted him, Paul shook the dust from his clothes and said, 'Your blood is upon your own heads. I am innocent.'" And I think that just paints a really clear picture of the conflict that he had and how it was really hard for him to relay the message to some people, because some people didn't have ears to hear or eyes to see. But he didn't give up. He didn't give up. And it's crazy because that speaks to the realness of God. It speaks to how Paul knows without a doubt how real Jesus is, because he's willing to be stoned, to die for Jesus, when he used to kill people that believed in Jesus. So the contrast is wild and just speaks to how Paul must have encountered God. There must be a reason Paul is so devoted, willing to die. And I think that in itself should make people curious. What is it about Paul that is so devoted to this guy that he's willing to die for him, when he used to be someone who hated Christians? He himself murdered them. It's a good message for us to remember, because when you start following Jesus, there's going to be opposition. There's going to be people who don't understand you, who misunderstand you often, who ridicule you, who reject you, who blatantly hate you because you're spreading the word of Jesus. Jesus experienced it. The apostles experienced it. So if you now follow the life of Jesus, you and I are going to experience it as well. And it's just encouraging because Jesus says, "Don't be afraid, speak out, don't be silent." In the midst of conflict, in the midst of rejection, in the midst of being misunderstood, don't be afraid, speak out, don't be silent. I think that's a really powerful thing to remember, because the devil wants us to be silent. The devil wants us to be afraid and to not speak and to be quiet and to be afraid of the opinion of man and to fear man. But God says, don't be afraid. The amount of times in the Bible, I think it's some crazy number, that it says don't be afraid is often. And it's just a reminder that the devil will try to get us to back down. The devil will try to get us to be afraid. He will try to get us to care about fear of man over fear of God. And we need to remember that that just comes with the territory. We're coming up against the world. We're coming up against culture. We're coming up against principalities, darkness, evil. And if we're spreading love and we're helping people see God clearly, the devil is not going to be very happy. So he's going to do whatever he can to try to discourage you, whatever he can to try to get you to feel less than or rejected or not enough, so that you shrink back and stop spreading the good news. But God reminds us to not be afraid, speak out, and to not be silent. I should have added verse 10 because I like the way it connects with verse 9. For I am with you, God says, and no one will attack and harm you, for many people in this city belong to me. The reason why we don't have to be afraid and we can speak out and be bold is because God is with us. We have the power of God on our side. We have the same power that defeated death on our side, the same power that overcame sin on our side. So if there's any plan of the enemy, any plan of sin coming our way, you and I have power to overcome it, have power to endure it, because God is with us. Today's verse reminds me of the power of speaking out our testimony and sharing what we're struggling with, because it disarms the enemy. When we speak out the truth and we speak out what God has done in our life, it not only is a testimony for someone else to tap into that same freedom, but it's disarming the enemy, because when you speak out, you don't leave room for the enemy to make you feel alone in it. You don't leave room for the enemy to isolate you. Isolation is the devil's playground. When you speak out and you bring people into your story and into your experience and into your struggle, you are partnering with God to help walk you through it. When you bring God into your struggle and you bring your community into your struggle, you're bringing them into the fight with you. So you're not fighting alone. And then we all remember, we're not the only ones struggling. Everyone else is struggling just like we are. And we understand that our struggle isn't our identity. Our struggle is just something we struggle with, and God can help us through it. Today's verse reminds me that I need to keep speaking up. I need to not be silent, because God is with me. And if he's done it for me, he can do it for someone else. And that's the power of our testimony, because Jesus is alive, right? If he set me free from something and he's still alive, that means he can set you free from it as well. So share your testimony, okay?